Imagine moving into a new house. The paint still smells fresh. The tiles echo under your footsteps. Your kids are excitedly opening cupboards, claiming rooms, racing through the hallway. Nothing about the place feels dangerous. In the spring of 1962, in a neighborhood on the outskirts of Mexico City, that was exactly the scene for a family of 5. A father, his pregnant wife, their 10-year-old son, their 2-year-old daughter, and the children's grandmother. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a slightly bigger house, a small yard, and the feeling that life was finally heading in the right direction. What they didn't know was that before they arrived, someone else had used that house for something very different. Hidden in the dust and weeds of the yard was a small object that did not belong to any family. It belonged to another world entirely, the world of nuclear science. It was barely larger than a pencil eraser, a small, shiny, metallic cylinder. To a trained physicist, it would have looked like a high-activity radioactive source capsule, the kind used in industrial radiography and cancer treatment machines. To a 10-year-old boy exploring his new yard, it looked like treasure, a futuristic piece of metal gleaming under the sun. One afternoon, while playing outside, he found it. He picked it up. It was cool and smooth. Heavy for its tiny size. No labels, no skull and crossbones, no radiation symbol, no guard, no warning. He slipped it into his pocket. In that moment, his fate, and the fate of his entire family, quietly changed. For days, he carried the capsule around like a secret toy. He rolled it between his fingers. He showed it off to no one. Sometimes he kept it in his pants pocket even while sleeping. It was always close to his skin. There was something eerie about it, something he couldn't put into words. The way it felt important, without looking important. But he was a child. Important meant interesting. Interesting meant fun. And nobody had ever told him that invisible things could kill you. Eventually, his mother found it. She was doing laundry, emptying his pockets, irritated at the little stones and bits of junk he kept bringing in from outside. When she reached into one pocket, her fingers closed around the capsule. Metallic. Oddly weighty. She took it out and looked at it for a moment, maybe raising an eyebrow. Another useless trinket. She put it aside and finished the laundry. Later, as she cleaned the kitchen, she picked the capsule up again and opened a cupboard. The one with the glasses and plates. Without thinking twice, she set the cylinder on a shelf and closed the door. From that day on, every time the family ate or drank, every time a plate was taken out, every time a glass was set on the table, something else came with it. Something no one could see, taste, or smell. Radiation. The capsule was no toy. It was cobalt-60, a synthetic radioactive isotope created inside a nuclear reactor and sealed in a metal capsule so it could be used in industrial and medical equipment. It was meant to live its entire life inside layers of protective shielding, safely locked away from the public. It had been manufactured in a lab, a place where a handful of people understood exactly how dangerous it was. That lab existed a world away from this family's kitchen. Different walls, different budgets, different priorities. But the decisions made there would now play out here, in the most intimate space a family can share. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Life went on. The boy went to school. The father went to work. The pregnant mother cooked meals, her unborn child growing day by day. The grandmother helped with chores, often standing close to that same cupboard. The little sister toddled around the kitchen, laughing at things no adult found funny. Then, small details began to change. The boy complained that he felt tired. His appetite dropped. He started to run a mild fever. His mother assumed it was the flu, a bug going around. Nothing unusual. But then she noticed something strange. The glasses in the cupboard started to change color. First, a faint darkening, then a deeper, smoky tint. Some of the plates looked as if they were being burned around the edges, even though they had never been near an open flame. It was unsettling, but easy to brush aside. Old glass, poor quality, maybe the heat, maybe the humidity. What she could not imagine was that the invisible radiation coming out of that capsule was bombarding the glass day and night, slowly changing its structure at the atomic level. The same thing was quietly happening to the family's cells. By the time anyone realized something truly abnormal was happening, the damage was already far beyond anything medicine could easily fix. And far away from the little house in Mexico City, in laboratories and offices, a different story was unfolding. A story about how such a capsule could be lost in the first place, and why nobody seemed to know where it had come from. To understand how a lethal capsule ended up in a family's kitchen cupboard, you have to leave the house and enter a very different kind of building. The lab. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, many countries were racing to modernize. Nuclear technology was the cutting-edge symbol of progress. Atomic energy promised clean electricity, advanced medical treatments, and powerful industrial tools. The dangers were known, but often treated as an acceptable risk in the pursuit of development. In that world, cobalt-60 was a star material. Create it in a reactor, seal it in a metal capsule, ship it as part of devices that could scan welds in pipelines and bridges for hidden cracks, sterilize medical equipment, treat cancer by bombarding tumors with focused beams of radiation. To make that possible, specialized facilities, from national reactors to private industrial labs, handled small but incredibly intense sources of radiation. Behind thick concrete walls and heavy lead shielding, technicians used remote tools to manipulate capsules that were too dangerous to touch with bare hands. On paper, these labs looked like fortresses of safety manuals, inventory logs, radiation badges, warning signs. But reality is never as clean as a document. Equipment gets old, people get tired, paperwork gets sloppy, and powerful technology spreads faster than the culture and systems needed to control it. Somewhere in that chain, maybe in a state facility, maybe in a private company, a source capsule was separated from its proper shielding. Perhaps it was removed for servicing. Perhaps it was part of a device that broke down. The exact details of the Mexico City accident's origin remain murky even today. Different reports point to different possibilities: a radiography unit, an industrial device, a forgotten container left in a yard by an engineer. But the outcome was the same. A live cobalt-60 capsule, still dangerously hot, left the controlled environment of the lab and entered the uncontrolled world. The people handling it might not have fully understood the risk. There may have been no malicious intent, just negligence, complacency, or the quiet pressure of saving money and time. A decision was made, somewhere, not to follow every rule, not to record every movement, not to guard every door. And because of that, the capsule became what experts now call an orphan source, a piece of radioactive material that has lost its owner, its paperwork, and its place in the system. In theory, orphan sources should not exist. In reality, they exist all over the world. Some sit forgotten in junkyards. Some are melted into scrap metal that becomes rebar or table legs. Some end up in garbage dumps, on trucks, or in storage rooms. And in 1962, one of them found its way into a family's new home. What makes this case especially haunting is that, on the day the family moved in, nothing in the house screamed danger. The source was in a container, or at least shielded enough that no one noticed anything. No light, no heat, no sound. Just a small piece of a global system, misplaced and abandoned. The people in the lab who had created or handled that capsule were probably proud of their work. They were part of the modern age, part of the future. In confidential reports and internal meetings, they spoke about dose limits and shielding thickness, about beam geometry and half-life calculations. They talked about safety. But none of them ever went to that family's funeral. None of them stood in the hospital watching doctors struggle to understand why a healthy boy was suddenly dying, or why his pregnant mother was wasting away, or why the little girl's tiny body was failing. In a way, this is what it means for a secret lab to alter human history. Not through science fiction, superweapons, or dramatic explosions, but through small objects, capsules, pellets, sealed pipes that escape the lab's walls and quietly enter everyday life. This accident was not unique. It was one line in a growing list of radiation incidents around the world, many of them involving lost or mishandled sources. But in Mexico City in 1962, that lesson wasn't yet clear. The family didn't know they had become part of a global pattern. They just knew that their son was getting sicker. By mid-April, the 10-year-old boy was in serious trouble. What had started as fatigue, nausea, and a mild fever escalated into severe vomiting and diarrhea. His temperature climbed dangerously high. His skin looked pale and waxy. His hair began to thin. And on his thigh, right where his pocket had pressed that capsule against his skin for days, a strange burn-like lesion appeared. His parents did what any parents would do. They tried rest. They tried home remedies. When that didn't work, they brought him to the hospital. Doctors examined him, and at first assumed they were dealing with an aggressive infection or some kind of poisoning. They ran tests, they gave him antibiotics, vitamins, IV fluids. None of it helped. Meanwhile, other family members began to feel unwell. The mother developed nausea, vomiting, and intense fatigue. Her appetite disappeared. She was pregnant, so doctors were especially concerned for her unborn child, but there was no obvious explanation. The little sister, just 2 years old, started having gastrointestinal problems. The grandmother felt weak and tired. The father, who spent much of his day outside working, felt bad too, but not as severely as the others. To everyone involved, it looked like a mysterious illness spreading through the family. No one suspected the kitchen cupboard. No one linked the symptoms to the darkening glasses or the tiny cylinder sitting silently on the shelf. No one knew to ask, "Have you found any strange metal objects lately? Has anyone brought something home from a yard or from work?" The doctors were trapped in the same blind spot as the family. They were searching for a virus, a toxin, a bad meal, not for ionizing radiation. For the boy, time ran out first. Despite treatment, his condition worsened. His immune system collapsed. Internal bleeding and organ damage quietly raced ahead of anything the medical team could reverse. On April 29, 1962, he died, just weeks after finding the capsule. He was only 10 years old. The loss shattered the family, but their nightmare was not over. The mother's symptoms continued to worsen. She lost weight, suffered severe nausea, and struggled with constant fatigue. Her unborn baby, wrapped in the same irradiated body, had no chance. On July 19th, she died as well, along with the child she had been carrying. If anyone had suspected radiation at that point, the story might have changed. The house could have been inspected. The kitchen could have been measured with a Geiger counter. The capsule might have been found and removed before more damage was done. But the true cause remained hidden. In August, the 2-year-old daughter died. In October, the grandmother followed. 4 people from the same household, dead within months. Only the father survived, and even he did not escape unscathed. The dose he received left him permanently sterile and haunted by questions that no one could fully answer for years. For the doctors, this cluster of deaths was a medical mystery that refused to fit into any neat category. The symptoms looked like an illness, but not exactly. The timing was strange. The pattern was odd. Eventually, someone realized that this was not an infection. It was something else, something that hit the blood, the bone marrow, the gut, and the skin all at once. Acute radiation syndrome. When the suspicion finally turned to radiation, investigators were brought in. Health officials began asking different questions. What did the family do for a living? Had anyone brought home industrial materials? Was there any equipment or scrap metal lying around? A survey of the house was ordered. When radiation detectors were finally brought into the home, they began to scream near the kitchen. The readings around the cupboard were far beyond anything normal. When the investigators opened the door and started moving plates and glasses aside, they found it. The capsule. Still quietly emitting radiation, still doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It had never changed. The only thing that had changed was where it was and who was standing near it. What began as a family tragedy now became something else. A case study. The Mexico City accident would be dissected in reports, referenced in scientific papers, and eventually used as an example of what happens when radioactive sources escape the controlled world of labs and industrial equipment. For the surviving father, that meant reliving his family's suffering in technical language. Doses in Gray and Sieverts, exposure times, distance from the source. For the rest of the world, it meant something even bigger. A warning. When the news of the Mexico City radiation accident reached scientists and regulators abroad, It landed in a context that was already tense. The world was in the middle of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons tests were shaking the atmosphere. Public fear of radiation was both real and, in some cases, poorly understood. But this case was different. It didn't involve nuclear bombs or melting reactors. It involved something much closer to everyday life. A single radioactive capsule that had slipped out of the industrial and medical system and entered a normal home. For nuclear safety experts, this accident looked like a flashing red warning light. It revealed several uncomfortable truths. Tracking systems for radioactive sources were weaker than anyone wanted to admit. The fact that a high-activity capsule could go missing, and stay missing long enough to kill 4 people, meant that somewhere, a lab or company had failed to notice a catastrophic loss. Public awareness of radiation dangers was extremely low. Nobody in the neighborhood recognized the radiation symbol. In this case, the capsule may not have even had one visible. To the boy and his parents, the object could have been anything. A part of a toy, a piece of machinery, a random bit of metal. Medical staff were not trained to recognize radiation symptoms in ordinary families. The boy and his relatives were treated for infection, food poisoning, and other likely causes. Radiation wasn't considered until it was far too late. Lab culture and industrial practices were not as fail-safe as people like to believe. Paper regulations did not always match day-to-day reality. Behind closed doors, organizations like national nuclear commissions and later international bodies such as the IAEA and UN SCIA began cataloging incidents like this one. The Mexico City accident joined a growing list of orphan source disasters. Over the following decades, more would be added. In Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, in the 1980s, a discarded radiotherapy unit, S-Cobalt-60, was melted into scrap metal and spread into thousands of tons of contaminated rebar. In Goiânia, Brazil, in 1987, scavengers found a medical device containing cesium-137. They broke it open, fascinated by the glowing powder inside, and caused one of the worst radiological accidents in history. Each incident, including the one in Mexico City, forced regulators to answer brutal questions. Who is responsible when a lab's product kills people far from the lab? How do you control something that remains dangerous for years or decades? How do you prevent invisible risks from slipping between the cracks of bureaucracy? The answers reshaped policies worldwide. Countries began to strengthen rules for licensing, tracking, and disposing of radioactive sources. Require better training for medical personnel in recognizing radiation syndromes. Harmonize warning signs and symbols to make radiation hazards more obvious. Create registries and inspection regimes to ensure that labs and hospitals knew exactly where their sources were and when they were decommissioned. The Mexico City accident didn't change history in the dramatic movie-style sense. It didn't stop a war or invent a new technology. Instead, it quietly altered how the world thinks about a specific kind of risk. The risk of powerful tools escaping the systems that are supposed to contain them. Think about it this way. Every time a new rule is written that requires a hospital to double-check its radiotherapy sources, every time an inspector walks through an industrial site with a detector, verifying that no capsule is missing, every time a medical team recognizes acute radiation syndrome early enough to save a life, they're working in the shadow of accidents like this one. The secret lab in our story is not just a physical place with locked doors and warning signs. It's the entire network of facilities, reactors, and research centers where radioactive materials are created, tested, and distributed. These places were once nearly invisible to the public. The Mexico City tragedy forced some of that invisibility to fade. It made clear that when something goes wrong behind those walls, the impact doesn't stay there. It can appear in a family kitchen, in a crowded neighborhood, in the pockets of a curious child. Today, if you walk through certain parts of Mexico City, you would never guess that a small house once became the site of a radiation disaster that killed most of a family. There is no obvious monument, no tourist plaque. The story survives mostly in technical reports, safety manuals, and scattered media articles. For many people, if they hear about it at all, it sounds like an urban legend, a mysterious illness, darkening glasses, a strange metal capsule. But this was not a myth. It was a real event with real data, real measurements, and real human beings who suffered and died. The father who survived lost his entire immediate family. He also lost his ability to have more children. The future he and his wife had imagined in that new house, noisy dinners, grandchildren running through the yard, was erased by a decision made in a place he would never see. That is the quiet horror of this story. The people who paid the price had never stepped inside a reactor hall, a radiography lab, or a nuclear research center. They never signed a consent form. They never saw the glowing blue light of a reactor pool or heard the click of a Geiger counter. They simply moved into a house. The secret lab that altered human history did so not through invention alone, but through failure. Failure to track, failure to warn, failure to imagine what could happen if the chain of custody broke. And yet, there is a second side to this legacy. Because experts studied this accident, because investigators reconstructed every detail they could, future lives have likely been saved. Safety standards tightened, lab procedures improved, international cooperation on radiation accidents grew stronger. The Mexico City case became one of the early, painful lessons that pushed the world to treat radioactive sources not just as tools, but as long-term responsibilities. It also carries a personal message for all of us living in the modern world. We are surrounded by technologies we don't fully understand: medical imaging devices, industrial scanners, complex chemicals, powerful data systems, and AI models. Most of the time, they work as intended. We benefit without ever seeing the labs where they were designed, tested, or built. But when something escapes those controlled environments, whether it's a capsule of cobalt-60, a toxic chemical, or a flawed piece of software, the consequences don't care whether we signed up for the risk. They only care that we're in the wrong place at the wrong time. The story of this family is a reminder that fate is not always a mysterious, supernatural force. Sometimes, what we call fate is simply the collision of a decision in a room full of experts, a missing line in a safety checklist, and an ordinary person who has no idea that their life has just been intersected by someone else's mistake. In 1962, a young boy found a shiny object and put it in his pocket. To him, it was a discovery. To us, it is a warning. Behind some of the most advanced technologies in our world are labs and institutions we rarely think about. Their work can cure cancer, power cities, and help us understand the universe. But when their tools slip through the cracks, they can also turn a normal home into a lethal experiment. That is how a secret lab altered human history, not with a single spectacular event, but by forcing us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that the invisible decisions made behind closed doors can shape, and sometimes end, the lives of people who never even knew those doors existed. And if there is one question this story leaves us with, it is this: in a world full of powerful hidden technologies, how many other capsules in the cupboard are still out there, waiting to be found?